The doctor sneered. "I've seen weekend hikers in worse shape," as two interns laughed, while Captain James Walker, a wounded Navy vet, stood frozen, humiliated in his pain. His spine throbbed, but something deeper shattered. That moment sparked a reckoning no one saw coming. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Captain James Walker stared through the windshield, his knuckles bone-white against the steering wheel. Rain lashed in thin diagonal sheets, ticking against the glass like fingers drumming out a verdict. The engine idled. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The VA file sat on the passenger seat, slightly curled from the damp, Halverson's signature slashed across the bottom in a hurried, impersonal scrawl. Non-essential, no further therapy recommended. Non-essential. That word echoed louder than the pain spiraling through his spine. James had once carried wounded men across burning sand, shielded a convoy under mortar fire, dragged a friend back through smoke so thick it choked daylight. His back hadn't given out then. It waited until the fight was over, until he was home, until he let himself believe he could live a normal life. Now he couldn't sit for more than an hour without feeling like a blade was lodged behind his hip. Walking without a cane meant gritting through agony. Sleeping? He'd forgotten what that was like, but somehow none of it was enough. Not for Halverson, not for the bureaucrats, not for this new world where value seemed measured in productivity and politeness, not sacrifice. He slammed his fist into the dashboard, once. The pain shot up his arm, but it grounded him. He didn't shout, didn't cry. That wasn't how James processed pain. For men like him, anger was the first language. It burned hot and clear, forging a path through helplessness. But it never stayed alone. Beneath the heat, there was always something colder. He looked down at his knee, twitching slightly from the strain. The brace he wore now, custom-fitted, government-issued, was just another quiet reminder of limits, of how fast things change. A year ago, he was teaching recruits how to clear buildings. Now he was arguing with a clerk over whether he'd qualify for a follow-up MRI. The thing that gnawed at him wasn't just that Halverson dismissed his injury, it was how easily he did it. As if everything James had lived through, IEDs, firefights, the surgeries, the screams, were nothing more than a soldier's sob story, something to roll his eyes at. James leaned forward and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. His breath fogged the glass. He hated this version of himself, the one who sat motionless while the world moved on, the one who doubted, second-guessed, wondered if he'd somehow overplayed his pain. Maybe that was the worst part, how the system didn't just reject you, it made you question your own truth. Somewhere deep in his mind, buried under the years of training and pride, he remembered something his mother once told him. "Anger is a fire, son. It'll keep you warm in the cold, but hold it too long and it'll burn right through your bones." And right now, James could feel the heat settling in. The morning sunlight poured through James Walker's kitchen window, soft and golden, catching in the steam rising from his coffee. He stood silently, mug in hand, as the TV in the corner played a muted news broadcast. A banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Navy terminates Maple Ridge contract. Investigation reveals widespread mistreatment of veterans." The words were surreal. He'd read the reports, watched the hearings, listened to hospital executives stumble through prepared statements, each one more hollow than the last. But none of it compared to seeing that headline, bold and impossible to ignore, cycling every 15 minutes across 3 networks. For the first time in weeks, James felt his spine ache less, not because the pain was gone, but because something heavier had lifted. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying, the shame of being dismissed, the rage of being powerless, the bitter taste of being silenced by people who had no idea what it meant to serve. It hadn't come easy. Filing the complaint was one thing. Watching it get buried under bureaucratic indifference was another. But reaching out to Admiral Foster? That took something else entirely. It wasn't pride he had to swallow. It was the fear that even someone like her might tell him to let it go, to move on. She hadn't. Elena Foster had listened, really listened. Not because he was a former subordinate, but because she still understood the code they all lived by. You never leave one of your own behind. Her fury had been measured, surgical. Within 48 hours, she had teams pulling personnel files, internal correspondence, and vetting Maple Ridge's entire record with Navy referrals. And when the ROT was exposed, she hadn't blinked. She'd driven the knife in, not out of vengeance, but principle. James hadn't sought revenge. He wasn't out for blood. What he wanted, what he needed, was for someone to say, "You matter. Your pain is real. Your dignity is not up for debate." And now, not just one person, but an entire institution had said it, loud enough for the whole country to hear. The calls came in waves, first from fellow veterans, some he knew, some he didn't. Men and women who'd been brushed off, minimized, humiliated. People who thought they were alone until James's name started appearing in articles. Then came the journalists, the reporters, the former patients of Halverson who finally felt safe enough to speak. Each voice added weight to the truth until it became too loud to suppress. James didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. But it was a good kind of tired, the kind that settles into your bones after a long fight you know was worth every step. He looked down at his cane, leaning against the counter, then out the window at the pale sky opening over the pines. He wasn't whole. Maybe he never would be, but he was heard, and in that moment, it was enough. Hope didn't always come with trumpets or banners. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in justice, in the quiet, fierce knowledge that you stood your ground and the world moved because of it. The hearing room was lined with oak panels and the kind of deep red carpeting that seemed designed to mute everything. Footsteps, voices, tempers. But when James Walker stepped to the microphone, the room felt electric. Not loud, not flashy, but taut with attention. He stood in his pressed blazer, navy pin glinting under the overhead lights, cane planted firmly by his side. His posture wasn't perfect anymore, but it held something stronger than physical form, conviction. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," he began. "I came here to tell the truth." No theatrics, no dramatics, just a voice tempered by pain, purpose, and months of reckoning. He told them about Maple Ridge, about the sterile hallways that offered no warmth, the laughter of interns who should have known better, the weight of Halverson's words, sharp and casual, like a paper cut across an old wound. But more than that, he spoke of what came after. The silence, the gaslighting, the sense that speaking up only made you a problem in the system. But the system, he said, pausing to let his words land, is meant to serve us. We kept our promise. We came home expecting the same. The panel didn't blink. They didn't shuffle papers. They listened. Because James wasn't speaking for pity. He was speaking for every man and woman who came back with scars you couldn't see and stories no one wanted to hear. For those who had swallowed indignity rather than risk their benefits. For those who couldn't navigate the acronyms, the waiting lists, the unreturned calls. After the hearing, a staffer from the VA approached him. Young, nervous, probably not long out of grad school. She shook his hand and said, "Sir, I didn't know. I didn't realize how bad it could get." And James had just nodded, not in condescension, but in solidarity, because now she did know. That was something. Back home, James didn't frame his testimony or chase media attention. He returned to what mattered, to volunteering at the local vet center. He sat with guys who hadn't left their houses in months, helped women still fighting battles with paperwork and trauma. He translated the system for those lost in its labyrinth. One night, after a workshop at a community college, a young Marine approached him, eyes shadowed by the kind of quiet that meant something deeper. "They didn't believe me," he said. "My doc said it was all in my head." James handed him a card and said, "Then let's make sure the next one does." His advocacy wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Policy groups began asking for his input. Local clinics revised their intake protocols. Slowly, faces in waiting rooms began to feel less alone. And in every room he entered, he carried the same closing line. You don't have to salute us, but don't dismiss us. We earned the right to be heard. It wasn't about pride, it wasn't about bitterness, it was about presence, about dignity, about turning pain into purpose and silence into signal fire. Because justice, when done right, doesn't roar, it resonates.